Last time we spoke about the Soviet-Japanese border conflicts. The border between Soviet Manchuria and Japanese-occupied territories emerges not as a single line, but as a mosaic of contested spaces, markers, and memories. A sequence of incidents, skirmishes along the Changkufeng rivers, reconnaissance sorties, and the complex diplomacy of Moscow, Tokyo, and peripheral actors to trace the risk escalated from routine patrols to calibrated leverage. On the ground, terrain functioned as both obstacle and argument. Ridges like Changkufeng Hill shaping sightlines, river valleys shaping decisions, and markers weathered by snow, wind, and drift. In command tents, officers translated terrain into doctrine, contingency plans, supply routes, and the precarious calculus of restraint versus escalation. Both of these nations sought to establish firmer defensive barriers against the other. Inevitably, they were destined to clash, but how large would that clash become? Nobody knew. This episode is the ChuangKufeng Incident. Hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. I can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we just covered Julius Caesar's first year as consul. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Now, in the last episode, we broke down a general history of the Soviet-Japanese border conflicts and how they escalated significantly by 1938. Colonel Inada Masusume, serving as the chief of the 2nd Operations Section within the Operations Bureau in March of 1938, would play a significant role in this story going forward. When the Japanese command's attention was drawn to the area of Changkufeng, consideration was given to the ownership and the importance of the disputed high ground. Inada and his Operations Section turned to an appraisal of geography. The officers had been impressed by the strategic importance of the two men, which served to cut off the hill country from North Korea. In the Changkufeng area, the river was a muddy 600 to 800 meters wide and about 3 to 5 meters deep. Japanese engineers had described rowing across the stream as rather difficult. Russian roads on the left bank were very good, according to Japanese intelligence. Heavy vehicles moved quite easily there. The Manchan section comprised the Russians' main line of communications in the rear. To haul up troops and material, the Russians were obliged to use trucks and ships, for there were no railways apart from the 4-kilometer line between the harbor and the town of Novosibirsk. Near Changkufeng, hardly any roadways were suitable for vehicle traffic. Now on the right side, or Korean bank of the two men, there were only 3 roads suitable for vehicle traffic, but even these routes became impassable after a day or two of rain. In the sector between Hill 52 to the south and Changkufeng to the north, the most pronounced eminences were Changkufeng and the humps of Changkufeng. Rocky peaks were characteristically shaped like inverted T's, which meant many dead angles against the crests. The gentle slopes would allow tanks to move but would restrict their speed, as would the ponds and the marshes. In general, the terrain was treeless and afforded little cover against aircraft. Against ground observation or fire, cornfields and tall grass would provide some shielding. Between Changkufeng and the two men, which would have to serve as the main route of Japanese supply, the terrain was particularly sandy and hilly. This rendered foot movement difficult, but would reduce the effectiveness of enemy bombs and shells. The high ground east of Kasan afforded bases for fire support directed against the Changkufeng region. Plains characterized the rest of the area on the Soviet side, but occasional streams and swamps could interfere with movement of tanks and trucks. The only other towns or villages were Novokivsk, Poziet, Yangomodi, and Khansi. At Kozando there was a dozen houses, at Peksikori a few. The right bank was farmed mainly by Koreans, whose scattered cottages might have some value for billeting, but offered none for cover. On the left bank, the largest hamlets were Fangchongting, with a population of 480, dwelling in about 73 huts, and Yangquangping, where there were about 39 cottages. Xiaoqiaofeng was completely uninhabited. Japanese occupation of ChuangKufeng would enable observation of the plain stretching east from Poziet Bay, although intelligence made no mention of Soviet naval bases, submarine pens, or airstrips in the immediate area of Poziet, either in existence or being built in 1938. As Inada knew, the Japanese Navy judged that Poziet Bay might have another use, as a site for Japanese landing operations in the event of a war. In Russian hands, the high ground would endanger the Korean Railway. This line, which started from Nanjing in the northeastern parts of Korea, linked up with the vital system in Manchuria at the town of Tumen, and provided a shortcut, if not a lifeline, between Japan and the Kwangtung Army, and Manchuria from across the Sea of Japan. Even from the relatively low Changkufeng, 6 or 7 miles of track were exposed to Soviet observation between Honggu and Shikai stations. The port of Nanjing, which is a fortress zone, lay about 11 miles southwest. Ungi lay even nearer. It was not the danger of Japanese shelling of Vladivostok, at an incredible range of about 80 miles, that was at stake, but the more realistic hypothesis of Russian shelling of the railway line, and Russian screening of the Soviet side of the border. Hills and questions were thought to have two sides. It was a consensus of Japanese that ChuangKufeng's hills' potential value to the Russians far outweighed its possible benefits to them, or at least that the Japanese had more to lose if the Russians took the high ground by the two men. Inada nurtured few illusions concerning the intrinsic values of the height. Despite the fact that High Command always had good reasons for keeping things quiet in the north, Inada believed that the latest border difficulty could not be overlooked. By mid-July of 1938, Inada's thoughts crystallized. The Japanese would conduct a limited reconnaissance in force, known as Iyoku Tesatsu, in a strategic sense. Whereas, at the tactical schoolbook level, this might mean the dispatch of small forces into enemy territory to seek local combat intelligence. At the Imperial General Headquarters level, the concept was far more sweeping. There would also be useful evidence of mobilization and other build-up procedures. The affair at ChuangKufeng was merely a welcomed coincidence, something started by the Russians, but liable to Japanese exploration. It had no intention of seizing territory, or becoming involved in a war of attrition at a remote and minor spot, or of provoking hostilities against the USSR. The Russians would comprehend the nature of the problem. If they were interested in interfering seriously with the Japanese, there were numberless better locations to cause trouble along the Manchurian front. Those were the places to actually watch. The cramped Changkufeng sector, described as narrow like a cat's brow, could too readily be pinched off from Hunchun to render it of strategic value to either side. The bogland to the north interfered with the use of armored forces, while artillery sighted on the heights along the Tumen in Korea could as easily control the areas as batteries in place east of the lake would. It was Inada's professional opinion that the Russians could commit 3 or 4 infantry divisions there at most, with no mechanized corps, no heavy tanks in particular. No decisive battle could be waged, although once the Russians became involved, they might have to cling to the hill out of a sense of honor. The military action would be meaningless, even if the Japanese let the Russians have the heights. As for their part, the Japanese would ostensibly be fighting to secure the boundary and to hold Changkufeng Peak, beyond which they would not move a step onto Soviet soil. There would be no pursuit operations. Troop commitment would be limited to about 1 division without tank support. Japanese Air Force intervention would be completely forbidden. Matters would be directed entirely by Imperial General Headquarters, working through the Korea Army chain of command, and carried out by local forces. Calm, clear, dispassionate overall estimates and instructions would be based on materials available only in Tokyo. The command would not allow the Kwangtung army to touch the affair at all. Inada foresaw that the Japanese government might also seek a settlement through diplomacy. Although border demarcation was desirable and should be sought, the command would not insist on it, nor would it demand permanent occupation of ChuangKufeng summit. As soon as reconnaissance objectives had been achieved, the local forces would simply be withdrawn. As Inada described it, in the process, we would have taught the Russians some respect and given them a lesson concerning their repeated high-handed provocations and intrusions. If a show of force sufficed to facilitate the negotiations and cause the Russians to back down, so much the better. The affair would be over and my point proved. The instrument for carrying out Inada's strategic design appeared to be ideal, the 19th Division, strenuously trained and high-spirited. It could be expected to perform very well if unleashed within defined limits. Colonel Sutaka was just the commander to direct local operations. Since he had been pleading to fight in China, an operation at ChuangKufeng might prove to be an excellent safety valve. His staff was full of experienced, fierce warriors eager for battle. Until recently, the Korea Army Commanding General had wisely kept the aggressive division away from Changkufeng Hill, but now Imperial General Headquarters had its own overriding ideas and needs. How could the Japanese ensure that any military action would remain limited if the Russians chose to respond with vigor? Naturally, one infantry division without armor or air support could not withstand all the Soviet forces in the maritime province. Inada answered that the mission to be assigned to the 19th Division was merely the recapture of Changkufeng's crest. If the Japanese side had to break off the operation, evacuation would be effected voluntarily and resolutely on Imperial General Headquarters' responsibility, without considerations of losing face. At worst, the Japanese might lose a division, but the affair would be terminated at the Tumen River without fail. Even so, we ought to be able to prove our theory as well as demonstrate our true strength to the Russians. In case the Soviets opted for more than a limited war, the Japanese were still not so overextended in China that they could not alter their strategic disposition of troops. Although the Kwangtung Army's 6 divisions were outnumbered 4-1, and the Japanese were not desirous of a war at that moment, the first-class forces in Manchuria could make an excellent showing. In addition, the High Command possessed armor, heavy artillery, fighters, and bombers, held in check in Manchuria and Korea, as well as reserves in the homeland. There was also the 104th Division, under tight Imperial General Headquarters control, in strategic reserve in the southern parts of Manchuria. Inada recalled, "How would the Russians react? That was the answer I sought. Victory in China depended on it." By mid-July, the High Command, at Inada's urging, had worked out a plan titled Imperial General Headquarters Essentials for Dealing with the ChuangKufeng Incident. A telegram was sent to Guizhou on the 14th of July, describing the just-decided policy that the central authorities concurred with the Korea Army's opinion regarding the ChuangKufeng affair. Considering that ChuangKufeng Hill posed a direct threat to the frontier of Korea, Imperial General Headquarters would immediately urge the Foreign Ministry to lodge a stern protest. The next day, Tojo sent a telegram stating the Japanese policy of employing diplomacy. Whether the Russians should be evicted by force required cautious deliberation in case the USSR did not withdraw voluntarily. On the basis of the guidance received from Imperial General Headquarters, the Korea Army drew up its own plan, known as Essentials for Local Direction of the ChuangKufeng Incident. This was drawn up on the 15th of July. Intelligence officer Tsuchiya Sakai was sent promptly to the front from Seoul. At the same time, military authorities allowed the press to release news that Soviet troops were constructing positions inside Manchurian territory in an obvious provocation. The government of Manchukuo was demanding an immediate withdrawal. Even then, those Japanese most closely connected with the handling of the ChuangKufeng incident were not in agreement that everybody at the command level was as ardent a proponent of reconnaissance in force as Inada claimed to be. Some thought most, if not all, of his subordinates, youthful and vigorous, were in favor of the notion. Others denied the existence of such an idea. Inada remained clear-cut in his own assertions. Everything done by the local Soviet forces, he insisted, must have been effected with the permission of Moscow. It was customary for the USSR not to abandon what it had once started. The Japanese army never really thought that the Soviet Union would withdraw, just as the result of a diplomatic approach. Therefore, from the outset, preparations were made to deal with the Russians one decisive blow. Inada had recommended his plan with its clear restrictions to his colleagues and superiors. The scheme, he said, was approved on the 14th of July. All the way up the chain of command, through the Army General Staff and the Ministry of War, with unexpected ease. The only real opposition Inada recalled came from the Navy, whose staff advised the Army Operations Staff, in all sincerity, to give up the idea of strategic reconnaissance. Inada adhered to his opinion stubbornly. He never forgot the grave look on the face of Captain Kozaka, the Navy Operations Section Chief, as the latter gave in reluctantly. The Navy view was that ChuangKufeng's affair typified the Army's aggressive policies as opposed to relative passivity on the part of the Navy. Like Kozaka, Japanese Navy interviewees shared the fear that ChuangKufeng might prove to be the most dangerous military confrontation ever to occur between the USSR and Japan. In view of the Navy objections, one wonders where Inada could have drawn support for his concept of reconnaissance in force. If one accepts the comments contained in a letter from the Navy Ministry Captain, Takagi Sokichi, to Baron Harada Komio at the beginning of August, in the Army and in a portion of the Navy there existed, quote, shallow-minded fellows who are apt to take a firm stand in the blind belief that the USSR would not really rise against us, neglecting the fact that the Russians had foreseen our weak points. Takagi also had violent things to say about the white-livered Gamusho elements that were being played out by the Army. Although Takagi's remarks expressed in confidence were sharp, cautious injunctions were being delivered by the High Command to the new Korea Army commander, General Nakimura Kotaro, who was about to leave for Seoul to replace Koizo. Nakimura's attitude was crucial for the course and the outcome of the ChuangKufeng Incident. More of a desk soldier than a warrior, he was still characteristically an ally. He displayed a wariness that was reinforced by the guidance provided by him. This personal quality assumes even greater significance if one believes that the Russians may have initiated the ChuangKufeng Incident by exploiting the special opportunities afforded to them by the routine replacement of the Korea Army commander. There was also the temporary absence from Moscow of Ambassador Shigemutsu Mamoru, and the geographical as well as subjective gap between the Kwangtung and Korea armies that was exposed during the Lushkov affair. At 10 a.m. on the 15th, Nakimura was designated army commander by the emperor at the palace. Shortly thereafter, he was briefed by Imperial General Headquarters. Hashimoto, the operations bureau chief, recalled that when he saw Nakimura off on the 17th of July, Hashimoto stressed prudence, limitation of any military action, and diplomatic solutions to the problem. The new commanding general, Inada asserted, promised full cooperation. There was no mention at that level of Inada's concept of reconnaissance in force. When Nakimura reached Seoul, he found an imperial order from Tokyo dated the 16th of July awaiting him. This document stipulated that he could concentrate units under his command in Korea near the border against the trespassing Soviet forces in the Changkufeng area. Resort to force, however, was dependent upon further orders. This message was followed by a wire from Prince Kenin, the Army General Staff Chief. The imperial order, as it was explained, had been designed to support diplomatic negotiations. Simultaneous approval was granted for concentrated forces to respond swiftly in case the situation deteriorated. As for the implementation of the imperial order, discretion should be exercised in line with the opinion expressed earlier by Korea Army Headquarters. Negotiations were to be conducted in Moscow and Harbin, the location of the Soviet consulate in Manchukuo. Meanwhile, the command was dispatching 2 officers for purposes of liaison, Lieutenant Colonel Arisu Yadoru in the operations section, and Major Konetani Etsuo, a specialist in Soviet intelligence. Inada advised Aruse that apart from liaison flights inside the frontiers, particular care should be exercised with regard to actions that might lead to air combat. Nevertheless, although Inada stated that the imperial order called for, quote, a sort of military demonstration, he admitted that it meant preparatory action for an attack. The Korea Army senior staff officer, Iwasaki, recalled hearing nothing about secret intentions. Nakimoto briefed his staff about the need for restraint, especially during this key period of the Wuhan operation. Koiso had disposed of speculation that he had issued an order to concentrate the 19th Division before Nakimoto arrived, although he and Nakimoto did have the opportunity to confer in Seoul before he departed for Japan. The Imperial Order of July the 16th, in response to Koiso's inquiry, received in Tokyo on the 14th, had arrived in Seoul, addressed to Nakimoto. Thereupon, the Korea Army Chief of Staff, Kitano, had the message conveyed to the division. By the 21st, Koiso was back in Tokyo, where the day afterwards he advised the War Minister, Itagaki, to act prudently with respect to the Changkufeng problem. But why did the High Command dispatch 2 field-grade liaison officers to Korea from the outset of the Changkufeng Incident? The Korea Army lacked operations staff. Its commander had been allotted prime responsibility within the chain of command for defense of northeastern Korea. At the beginning, the highest-ranking staff officer at the front was a major. Since there were no fundamental differences of opinion between the command and the forces in Korea, it was proper to send experts from Tokyo to assist. Imperial General Headquarters would observe the situation carefully, devise measures on the basis of the overall view, and issue orders, which the Korea Army would implement through ordinary channels. It had not been the type of incident which required the Army commander to go to the front to direct. This was the Korea Army's first real test, and political as well as diplomatic problems were involved that the Army in the field should not or could not handle. If Tokyo had left decisions to the divisions and its regiments, the latter would be held to account, which was not proper. Imperial General Headquarters had to assume responsibility and reassure local commanders of its full support. Momoka Yutaka explained that the operational guidance by the Imperial General Headquarters and line operations conducted by the 19th Division formed the core of the affair. The Korea Army placed between was shadowy. Koiso had not been enthusiastic. This set the mood amongst the staff. Nakimoto, who arrived with thorough comprehension of the thinking going on, was basically passive. The Korea Army staff in general included no wild boars. There was an urgent need to monitor developments. Not only was the Korea Army unfamiliar with handling this type of incident, but many hitches occurred. There had been no practice in emergency transmission of coded wires between the Korea Army and Tokyo. Now, telegram after telegram had been sent, most were deciphered incorrectly, and many were not decoded at all. Another problem centered on the lack of knowledge in Tokyo about the situation on the spot, which only visual observation could rectify. As a result, the 2 Army General Staff experts, Arase and Katani, arrived in Korea on the 16th. Katani recalled that he was to collect intelligence and assist the local authorities. One of the first duties that he and Arase performed was to disseminate the principle that use of force required a prior imperial order. On the 16th, Japanese newspapers reported that the USSR was still concentrating troops, that the Manchukuoan government was watching intently. Decisive punitive measures were being contemplated by the Japanese Manchukuoan authorities, and there were signs of a worsening of the crisis. Despite good reasons for this gloomy appraisal, the Japanese press had not yet given the incident page 1 treatment. More alarming news was being disseminated abroad. Dome, the official Japanese news agency, reported that the situation would probably become worse unless the Soviet troops withdrew. The position of the Japanese government impressed foreign correspondents as unusually firm. Informants characterized the ChuangKufeng Incident as the most serious affair since the clash on the Amur River back in 1937. Irked by the Korea Army's timidity and eager for first-hand information, the Kwangtung Army dispatched 2 observers to the front. From intelligence, Ogashi Kenji, and from operations, one Tsuji Masinobu. Now, if you're a listener of my Pacific War Week by Week podcast or Echoes of War, you know I really like to highlight Tsuji Masinobu as one of the most evil Japanese officers of the war. There really is no other way to describe this guy. He was a shithead. Anywhere Tsuji Masanobu went would turn into some kind of false flag incident, or, in terms of World War II, usually a string of war crimes. Anyways, In his memoirs, Tsuji asserted that he and Ogoshi climbed ChuangKufeng Hill, discerned Soviet soldiers digging across the peak in the Manchurian territory, and concluded that probably even Tokyo could not overlook such a clear-cut case of the invasion. Although his account aligned with the general thrust, Ogoshi contended that Tsuji could not have accompanied him. According to sources with the 19th Division, when Koizio learned that Tsuji and Goshi were disparaging the Korea Army's ability to defend ChuangKufeng, he ordered those spies ousted. Ogoshi replied that the army staff was not angry, but Koizio did become furious and he ordered Ogoshi arrested for trespassing. Ogoshi surmised that Koizio's concern was that emotional outsiders, such as Tsuji, could provoke trouble, perhaps even war, if they visited ChuangKufeng. And that view was widely shared amongst many. Inada stated that he made a practice of keeping away to maintain the degree of detachment and impartiality required of high command authorities. One sidelight to the fraternal visit of the ChuangKufeng area by observers from Xinqing was provided by Lieutenant Colonel Katakura Tadashi, chief of the Kwangtung Army's 4th Section, which handled Manchukuo affairs. When Katakura visited the operations section, Tsuji and Ogoshi told him that an intrusion had been confirmed and that the Kwangtung Army staff was studying ways to evict the Soviets. Katakura consulted Major General Ishiwara Kanji, acting chief of staff at the time, who was already in possession of the draft of an operations order calling for offensive preparations by the Kwangtung Army against the Russians at ChuangKufeng. Katakura asked for reconsideration of the order. This was not a matter to be handled solely by the operations staff. Borders and international affairs were involved, hence the 4th Section, along with the Manchukuoan government. The Gaimusho and other agencies were all concerned as well. Field observers were expressing exaggerated personal opinions based on having seen Soviet sentries on the hilltop. If the matter fell within the Korea Army's defensive prerogative, that army ought to handle it. Apparently, the Kwangtung Army commander and Ishiwara agreed with Katakura for the draft order to not be approved. The so-called private message dispatched by the Kwangtung Army staff officer just before Koizio's departure may have been provoked by this rejection of direct participation by forces under the Kwangtung Army's command. Staff officers in Tokyo believed that Xinqing could not see the forest for the trees. In the High Command's view, the Kwangtung Army's deliberate escalation of what was a negligible frontier incident undoubtedly stemmed from a failure to grasp the strategic requirements of the national defense, the pursuit of the campaign in China, the nurturance of Manchukuo, and the buildup of operational readiness for the ultimate solution to the Soviet problem. The High Command felt obliged to remind the Kwangtung Army that in dealing with the ChuangKufeng Incident, the central authorities pressed for a Russian pullback through diplomacy. Consequently, the Korea Army had been instructed to be ready to concentrate troops near ChuangKufeng as a background. Meanwhile, it remained the imperial will that utmost prudence be exercised. The Kwangtung Army commander accordingly issued cautious instructions to subordinate units, especially those on the eastern border. The High Command's injunctions did not end the discontent and recrimination at the lower levels of the Kwangtung Army headquarters, nor did they quiet the concern felt in Tokyo. A former war minister told Baron Harada repeatedly in late July that the Kwangtung Army was no good, while the superintendent of police added that the Kwangtung Army was embarrassing for Minister Ugaki at the time. Nevertheless, the Kwangtung Army did exert self-restraint. Surprisingly, I know. For its part, the Korea Army naively sought to achieve entente with an antagonist who considered the case non-negotiable. First, the government of Manchukuo was asked to launch a formal protest with the USSR. The commissioner for foreign affairs at Harbin phoned Vivi Kuznetsov, the acting consul, on the night of the 14th and saw him on the 18th. Basing its contentions on maps, the Hongqing regime demanded Soviet withdrawal from ChuangKufeng. The Japanese government was lodging similar protests within the framework of the Japanese-Manchukuoan Joint Defensive Agreement. On the spot, the situation inflamed. During the afternoon of the 15th, a Japanese military police patrol from Korea was doing a bit of a reconnaissance at the foot of Hill 52, just southeast of ChuangKufeng. The party came under Soviet gunfire, and they were driven back. They were forced to abandon the body of Corporal Mutsushima Shakuni. Japanese sources claimed that a Russian ambush had been set inside Manchuria. The Russian side insisted that this was Soviet frontier, that it was the Japanese who violated it by about 30 meters. Kuzma Grebenik, the colonel commanding the 59th BGU, which covered the Pozyet sector, asserted that Matsushima's FX included a notebook containing reconnaissance results and a camera with film of Soviet-claimed terrain, particularly ChuangKufeng Hill. According to Major Gelfan Batarshin, a subordinate of Grebenik, 2 Russian border guards from Podgornaya opened fire when the Japanese fled after being challenged. Japanese protests to the USSR about the death of Matsushima and the taking of his body were added to the negotiations concerning the disputed border and the alleged trespassing. Judge Nishi Haruhiko lodged a vigorous complaint in Moscow on July 15th, but was answered by a counter-protest. Ambassador Shigemitsu underwent an identical experience during a conversation with Foreign Commissar Maxim Litvinov on the 20th of July. Shigemitsu reported that the murder tended to exacerbate the negotiations. In his memoirs, he stated that the killing of Matsushima provoked the local Japanese border garrison unit. The shooting occurred as the Soviet military buildup continued, according to Japanese sources. Mechanized units were reported moving in the direction of Gyeongkun from Barabash and Pozyet Bay. Biplanes were doing reconnaissance over the Hunchuan Valley, within Manchurian territory. To the local Japanese authorities, it seemed that the Russians were adopting a challenging attitude. Although the Japanese Manchurian side remained willing to negotiate, that is, to take no forceful actions if the Russians would withdraw, the latter appeared not to share such an intention. The Soviets were not only misinterpreting the Hunchuan Treaty to their advantage, but they were encroaching beyond what they claimed to be the line. They lacked any sincerity. Decisive use of force might have been imperative to secure the Manchurian border, which was Japan's legal responsibility. As far north as Tongning on the eastern Manchurian frontier, 2 Soviet ground divisions and considerable numbers of tanks and aircraft were reported massing in full view. At Changkufeng, Russian soldiers fortified the crest. Mountain guns were now seen with muzzles pointed towards Manchuria, and Japanese intelligence estimated that Soviet troop strength near Changkufeng had grown to about 130 by the evening of the 18th. As Sawemoto Rikichiro, an imperial aide, noted in his diary, it would seem that settlement of the affair had become increasingly difficult. Korea Army Staff Officer Tsuchiya sent 2 emissaries bearing the notice to the Soviet border. The 2 men set out on July 18th, carrying a message in one hand and a white flag in the other. From Gyeonghun came the report the next day that there had been an urgent, well-attended Soviet staff meeting at the BGU headquarters in Novokivsk that night. It seemed the Russian side had been discomforted by the Japanese request, which had been transmitted to higher authorities. Still, the emissaries did not return, while a stream of reports indicated Soviet buildup along a dozen frontier sectors. Russian authorities had reportedly forced the natives to evacuate an area 20 miles behind their borders. From Japanese observation posts, Soviet convoys of men, guns, and horses could be sighted moving towards Novokivsk after being unloaded from transports originating at Vladivostok. Japanese Army intelligence reported on July 18th a regimental-sized force had arrived at Novokivsk. Artillery displacements were forward, and they were particularly visible by night east of Kazan. The confidential Gamuso message indicated that Soviet truck movements between Pozyet, Novokivsk, and the front had increased since the 20th. Russian intrusions, kidnappings, and sniping incidents were reported along the Manchurian borders, from Manchuli on the west to Suifan Ho on the east, between the 18th and 25th of July. Aircraft on daytime reconnaissance were detected as far as 3 miles inside Manchurian territory in the Hunchuan area. Although the Japanese asserted that their forbearance was being tested, the Russians stated that the Japanese militarists were simply manufacturing an affair at Isuri as well as ChuangKufeng. The Japanese themselves received reports from ChuangKufeng's front that by the 20th, the Soviets had about 250 soldiers, armed with field pieces, trench mortars, howitzers, and light and heavy machine guns on the southern slopes. The Russians were putting up tents capable of holding 40 men each. Officers could be observed for the first time. On the evening of the 20th, the Soviets lobbed illuminating shells towards Manchurian territory. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, which helps produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or Echoes of War, my podcast series found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. Inada studying maps and mud saw ChuangKufeng Hill as a prize with peril, a test of nerve rather than a conquest. Tokyo's orders pulsed through Seoul and Harbin: guard, probe, and deter, but avoid full-scale war. Yet across the border, Soviet units pressed closer, lights and tents flickering on the hillside. The sea within sight whispered of strategy, diplomacy, and a warning. A single misstep could redraw Asia. And now we had a Mexican standoff.